Hi, everyone. I'm Mildred Warner, and I'm really happy to be here today to introduce Professor David Brown. I understand there's a no technology policy in this classroom, which seems really strange because they're asking you to sign in using your phone. And I'm going to use the laptop to keep me on track about David's introduction. But I guess they think you can't take notes on laptops. So you have to use pen and paper. And there are some educational scholars who say you learn it better if you actually write it. But I guess that depends on how you learn. But technology aside, we are really privileged today to have David Brown present. He was a former chair of this department back when it was called Development Sociology. He's a renowned rural sociologist, former president of the Rural Sociological Society. He has published numerous books. And today, we're going to get the insight into his latest book, and I'm super excited to be here because we need a theoretical frame for thinking about rural development issues. He's raised numerous grants. He's been an innovator, doing a lot of work also in Eastern and Central Europe, not just in the US. He's also a specialist on issues around aging, and he was my first boss at Cornell. So it's a really nice come around moment. So welcome, David. We look forward to hearing your presentation.
I've got to get this technology working. Middle button, right? Can you hear me? Okay. I've been told that I'm going to have letters on my face unless I stand over here, but I move around some, so we'll see how that works. Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much, Mildred, for the nice introduction. And thank to Mariah for setting all this up. And I'm terrible with names. That you're Anna. Thank you for figuring out the computer and everything. And I don't know your name, but he was the real guru for getting this all loaded up. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is to talk a little bit about a book that I've just published. I guess it came out in 2024 in December, but it really is just new this year. And let's see. So, okay. So let me just say a little bit about the origin of this book, where it came from. Well, there's a publisher in England named Edward Elgar, and they invited me to write this book in a series that they call Rethinking. And Elgar asked senior scholars in all types of different disciplines, social science, biological sciences, the whole thing, to prepare such books, and in the series called Rethinking. Now, the way I interpreted Rethinking was to look backward, to look forward, not just to do a summary of or a state-of-the-art review, but to talk about what this meant for future practice in this area of research on rural issues. So I asked them if I could invite my colleague, Mark Shucksmith, and that's Mark right there, who's a professor at Newcastle University in the UK, to co-author the book, and he agreed. So what you're hearing today is really a product of our work together. Now, this invitation really came at a good time for me because I'd been retired for about 5 years, but I was still professionally active. And I was really starting to begin to think about what my career might have amounted to. And so I saw it more as an opportunity to write a capstone of thinking about this whole idea of rural studies. And like Mildred said, more from a theoretical perspective. Typically, when I've made professional presentations, it's to report on the results of some empirical research I've done. There's a little bit of what I'm going to say today about some empirical work, especially some work on the impact of aging on the availability of services, and work that I've done with my colleague, Nina Glasgow, who's sitting up here. And so again, I thought this was a very good opportunity to say, also to say a lot of things, to be honest, that editors of books and journals had encouraged me not to say earlier on. So we'll see how it goes. And I'm not sure which one goes forward. No, that's the wrong way. Okay, so what I plan to do today, I'm going to discuss this idea of rural studies, and I'm going to pay particular attention to the theoretical perspectives that shape and motivate this perspective. Then I'm going to discuss a couple of cases where this rural studies approach deepens research into rural people and communities and economies, and illustrate these with a couple examples from my own empirical research. And then I'm going to situate rural studies in the broader area of public social science. Now, my work, as Mildred said in the introduction, has mostly been in the US, the UK, and in Eastern Europe. And so I know a lot of you people who are in this class are more interested in the global South. And I'm not completely sure what I have to say, how much relevance it'll have for you, but I'm pretty sure it will. That if you're interested in rural people and communities in developing nations in the globalized world, I think that this will have a fair amount of relevance, but we'll see. Okay, so a few basics. I guess I better say what I think about how I think about rural, and also how I think about the idea of rural studies. Now, rural is a seemingly simple concept, but it's more complex than you might imagine, and there's also a lot of ambiguities in terms of deciding what's rural and what's not. So one way of looking at this is a binary between urban and rural. In other words, distinctly different urban and rural spaces, perhaps even polar opposites, or as a variable. In other words, what's the degree of rurality of particular places in a nation? Now, my perspective is more toward the variable in terms of degrees of rurality, rather than saying this is urban and this is rural. There are also a couple different conceptual ways to look at this. And one is a very positive view, a sort of a pastoral, sentimental view of rural as a repository of cultural values, of romantic notions of rural life. And at the opposite is a perspective that looks at rural more as a backward area. In other words, requiring modernization, being left behind through the process of development. So obviously, so sort of carrying on from that, rurality and the development of urbanization, which are very closely connected concepts, are part of a whole narrative of uneven spatial development. And so Marxists have said a lot about this, neo-Marxists, and the idea here is that the capitalist core, the urban core, dominates and exploits the rural periphery. And they use a metaphor of internal colonialism. Now, regional economics also has a lot to say about uneven spatial development, and some regional economists are neo-Marxists and many aren't, but they all have this concept of an urban hierarchy. And this implies dominance of the urban over the rural, and with a top-down differential in power. Neither of these approaches gives much agency or power to the rural areas. Now, the rural studies perspective I'm going to introduce today makes a space for power in the rural areas. And I would never be so naive as to say that the urban areas are not more powerful than the rural in national economies and social structures, but that doesn't mean that rural areas don't have power, or at least the potential for power and agency. And so I'll try to develop that idea. So how would one know what's rural? Again, there are different ways to think about this. One conceptualization is what I would call a structural or a demographic perspective. And honestly, this is the way I've worked most of my career. And this has a bunch of different attributes or variables that you would use to separate rural and urban, or to have a scale of urbanity that goes from the most highly urban to the most highly rural. And this uses variables like population size and density, different kinds of land use, dependence on agriculture and other extractive industries. And again, most national statistical systems use this approach. So if you go to the UN, there's a book called World Urbanization Prospects, and for every nation in the world that belongs to the UN, I guess that's every nation now, you can find the percent urban and percent rural and look at it over time. The issue here, the problem is that they use different criteria for most of these different nations, and so they're really not comparable. The other way to look at this is what I would call a social constructivist approach. And in this, rurality is a social construct or an imaginary. And this is more interpretive, and it has to do with experiences, identity, and belonging. Now, if Rich Stedman was here today, I would say a little something about how he looks at this, because this is more the way he looks at the idea of place, more through an interpretive lens. Neither of these approaches is hegemonic, and rural studies actually employs both. Another thing that I want to point out is that you can think about rural and rurality in both a micro and a macro way. And if you want to look at it in a macro way, this is really rural as an attribute of place, so that you have different places, and you could say, well, this is more or less rural than this one over here. But another way to look at this is as an attribute of people who live in these places. So are these rural people or urban people? And so these are somewhat different. Now, today, most of what I'm going to talk about is the macro approach, looking at places and talking about settlement structures. But a lot of my work also has focused on the micro and looked at rural households and people as well. Okay, so lots of different, so again, rural and urban, not so simple. Could be complex when you start thinking about what they are. Okay, what's rural studies? Got myself a little water here. Hold on a minute. I used to teach in this room, by the way, right? But I haven't been on campus in about 3 years, so we'll see how this goes. Okay, so what do I mean by rural studies? Well, this is an inherently socio-spatial field of social scientific inquiry. And I see it as transdisciplinary, not multidisciplinary, which I see as additive, economics and sociology and geography, but transdisciplinary. In other words, interaction, where you get the synergy between the different disciplines coming together. And also this synergy is both conceptual and methodological. And so rural studies typically involves both quantitative and qualitative approaches to research of various types. And again, another, I think, hallmark of this approach, at least as I see it, is that it involves genuine interaction among disciplines and methodological approaches from a project's inception, not after the fact. So there's a lot of people who do regression and they look at the residuals from regression. They say, why didn't these things fit the pattern? And we're going to do some case studies. We're going to go and interview these people who aren't on the regression line, and we'll find out why our model didn't predict their behavior. And then we'll go back and we'll revise our survey, and then we'll be all great. That's not what I think of as transdisciplinary and from a methodological standpoint. I'm talking about at the beginning of a project, thinking about the various types of methods that we use, the various types of theoretical frameworks that will be involved and shape the project. Now, this is an ideal type. I'm not saying everything that people in the rural studies area do fits this model, but this is how I see rural studies as an ideal type. Rural studies contributes to disciplinary knowledge, but it's not strictly disciplinary oriented. So it has a problem-oriented approach, and it promotes deliberation and debate. And for this, I want to go, and I will a little later on talk about a guy named Michael Borovoy, who gave a paper to the American Sociological Association called Public Sociology, and I'll just substitute public social science. And so, again, this extends beyond the academy and embraces the production of knowledge for societal reasons. Okay. Now, I'm going through a lot of stuff, and if you want me to stop, just put your hand up, and I'll try to respond. And then also there'll be opportunities after when I'm finished. It'll be a half hour. Someone's got a sign that's going to stop me. So, okay. So what's the main theoretical perspective that shapes this book and also my sense of rural studies? That's the idea of embeddedness. And embeddedness has to do with relationships, networks, and interdependencies. And in this, rural places and communities are linked to larger and smaller places within nations and beyond nations. So this whole idea of linkage doesn't necessarily stop at the national border. So global processes also affect localities. This is powered by the whole idea of enhanced mobilities. Geographers and planners talk a lot about mobilities. And basically this talks about the movement of people, capital, information, natural resources, biological vectors, COVID-19, for example, across social and economic space. These mobilities and the interdependencies that develop as a result of these mobilities certainly make open places up to more risk and vulnerability, but they also give places increased opportunities for interaction, for obtaining resources and information, for bringing people with different skills in or not. And so that's important. Another thing, this perspective has a causal perspective. It wants to understand why things happen and the results of things happening, determinants and consequences. And it wants to go beyond sort of this mechanistic descriptive analysis. All of a sudden, I'm getting feedback. Okay, well, if there's a problem, I think we're okay. So I see these things as black boxes where you have this is over here, the independent variable, the cause, and over here, the result. And nothing's in between. And I think that part of the rural studies goal is to go in the in-between and look at the structures, the social, economic, political structures, the decisions that are made at the collective level that lead to different outcomes from, and then later in the talk, I'm going to give an example of some work that Nina and I have done on the effect of extreme aging on availability of services in places. Okay. So I'm going to wind this out a little bit more because I think Mildred and others told me they wanted the sort of the theoretical development. What are some of the attributes of a rural studies perspective? First of all, looking at social and economic relationships across space. So this is a multi-scalar perspective. And rural places are linked with nearby places as well as ones that are farther away. And these relationships are infused with power. And this, I think, is a very important attribute of rural studies. It has a lot to do with power and inequality and differences in power. Smaller, more rural places are relatively less powerful. Nobody would dispute that, but they don't necessarily lack complete power in their relationship with larger places. So like this central place theory that geographers and regional scientists use that has this sort of hierarchy of places, and the assumption is that the bigger the place, the more power. In general, that's true, but that's not to say that the relatively smaller places can't act back, that there aren't some things, and in a little while, I'm going to identify what I think some of the attributes of places, smaller places, that give them more opportunities to exert power are. So in other words, this urban hierarchy, I think it sees as a black box that masks the power of rural places. A second defining attribute, relationships among places are important, but they are not the only thing. And places themselves continue to have importance, even though we want to look at how places are linked together, networked together, what have you. So places have, in places, by places, we mean towns and villages and crossroads and wherever you have a node of people living and working together. Places have both material, that is institutional coherence, and they also have an imagined reality. So people are embedded in places where they live and work. So, I mean, you live in Ithaca now, and so you have to find out where to buy food and where to go to church or the temple or to the mosque. You have to you satisfy your needs of everyday life in this place. But also places are repositories of meaning and their reference for personal identity. If you go out and ask people, give me 5 attributes of you, who you are, one of them is probably going to be where you live. So personal identity has, and so Stedman and others have called this place identity. So we have the relationships and the attributes of the place itself, its institutional structures. And in my perspective, the viability, the well-being of rural places is contingent on a combination of these two, both the capacity and responsiveness of local communities, the governance, the educational system, the labor market, and having effective external relationships. Again, not necessarily just with the places close by, could be, in our case here with Washington, D.C., that relationship's really being tested at the present time, and also globally. And thirdly, having residents that are committed to the place, that identify with the place. In my opinion, places that have that combination do better than places that are less. And I would say, Mildred, not to speak for you, but I think a lot of your work on neoliberalism and how that's affected the capacity of local places, I think relates to this narrative. Okay, finally, rural studies rejects the rural-urban binary. This goes back to one of my first things where I said, you can look at rural and urban as polar opposites, or you can look at it as a scale from the most highly urban to the most highly rural. And so this binary would say this is urban, this is rural, and there's a boundary between them. But the rural-urban boundary both separates rural from urban, but it also joins rural and urban. And Dan Lichter and I have written quite a bit on this. Dan is a professor here at Cornell in human ecology, and we've talked about the idea of the urban-rural interface. And this interface is definitely defines urban from rural, separates, but it's defined by intense social, economic, and natural interactions. So this is a space of intense interaction. And the social organization of this urban-rural interface is produced and given meaning by the social, economic, and natural relationships that occur within it. So if you wanted to study the urban-rural interface, you could do it geographically and say, well, I'm going to go out 50 miles from Ithaca and see, and that's the urban-rural interface. But what you really want to find out is the interactions between the people who live in Ithaca and live in the towns of Ulysses and Dryden, Groton, what have you. And so that's my sense of what the urban-rural interface is. And I think a lot of the action in society today is in the urban-rural interface. Now, finally, I was going to put this at the end, but I'm going to put it up here. Rural studies aspires to be public social science. Again, Michael Burawoy was the president of the American Sociological Association in 2004, and he gave his presidential address, which at that time was rather unconventional because it had to do with applied social sociology and a discipline that wanted to see itself as completely theoretical. So the name of his address was For Public Sociology, and fun fact, he gave a draft of that presentation here at Cornell in the Polson Institute annual lecture. We brought him in, he gave a terrific lecture, and he's just a great guy. So he identified 4 kinds of sociology, and I'm going to, again, I'm going to substitute social science in there. He probably would have opposed that, but I'm going to do it. He talked about professional, and that's the core knowledge of the discipline. Critical, which basically questions, challenges the orthodoxies. Policy, and in this case, policy social science, works with the government and NGOs and what have you, and the research agenda is determined by the client, by government and what have you. But then there's public sociology, and this is a social science that engages with a diverse public outside of academia and outside of government and NGOs, with civic society, civil society, and it embraces knowledge exchange and it's also infused with values. Now that was very controversial for sociology in 2004 because everybody wanted to think about value-free social science. Well, public sociology is infused with values, and it's also an action-oriented knowledge knowledge generation. Again, rural studies aspires to be public social science, engaged and collaborative with visible, thick, active local publics. Again, I would identify Mildred's work in this way. There's a lot of the work that she's done on county services and what have you. Embraces the knowledge exchange and dialogue, again, about values and progress. Progress is a value statement. Same thing with development. And it promotes social relationships that have to do with human dignity, enhancing human dignity. So this is how I see rural studies. It's spatial, it's engaged, it's transdisciplinary, and it refutes the idea of urban and rural being completely different and dissociated from each other. Well, how did I come to be interested in rural studies or in transdisciplinary work at all? One sec. Anybody who's known me very long, Mildred and Nina have known me the longest of anybody around here. For the first 2/3 of my career, I was not a transdisciplinarian. I wasn't even a multidisciplinarian. I never supported anybody in the Department of Development Sociology who didn't have a PhD in sociology. I examined their academic accomplishments through their contributions to sociology. I was a hard case. This was kind of ironic because, first of all, my PhD is in sociology from the University of Wisconsin, but I had my assistantship in the Center for Demography. Now, demography, which is the study of human population, is an inherently transdisciplinary area of study. You can't study population dynamics without knowing something about economics, geography, actually biology. The big push now in demography is in sociobiology. So, and also I worked for 15 years for the USDA's Economic Research Service. There were about 5 or 7 sociologists among 150 economists, and that didn't change my opinion any. I came out of there, came to Cornell as a sociologist. So what opened my eyes to the power of transdisciplinary engaged social science? First of all, as I said, Michael Borovoy came here and gave a talk on public sociology, and I thought it made a lot of sense. And secondly, I had a sabbatical. Actually, Nina and I both were on sabbatical at the same time. This is Nina Glasgow, by the way. She's my colleague, and she's a well-known social gerontologist. If you're interested in aging, she's the one. So this sabbatical we had was at Newcastle University in England, and it was in the Center for Rural Economy. Okay, so this is Newcastle. Anybody who wants to go there? It's a very handsome, has some very handsome Edwardian areas in it. And if you wanted to see where the coals came to Newcastle, they came on the Tyne River. And that's there. This is a building in Newcastle University. It's one of the so-called red brick universities. In about the 1950s, England decided they had to train a bunch of middle-class people, that they couldn't get enough human capital out of Oxford and Cambridge and a few other places. So they built a bunch of these universities, Manchester, Leeds, whatever, Newcastle. And so you might say, why does he have a picture of Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King on this slide? This is crazy. Well, here's the story. First of all, I read Frederick Douglass's biography a few years ago. And one of the ways Frederick Douglass sort of organized his profession, he gave a lot of talks in England and Ireland and other places, went around and people would donate money to him. So he had a lot of fans in the British Isles. And a couple of them who lived in Newcastle provided the money to buy his freedom. And so that's a Newcastle story. And why Martin Luther King? Well, Martin Luther King received his only honorary doctorate from a European university during his life from Newcastle University. This is my colleague Mark, and this room that he's standing in is the room where Martin Luther King gave his honorary address when he received his honorary doctorate. So at any rate, we went to Newcastle University into the Center for Rural Economy, and we saw about 20 people from every discipline, many that we didn't recognize, like land economy and things that they got PhDs in I never heard of before. But you know what? They were all working together. They were getting grants and forming projects and working and publishing good stuff. And they had a really interesting extension program that when we came back from Newcastle, Nina actually replicated in upstate New York. And so this changed my opinion on things. And when I came back to Cornell, I voted in favor of Wendy Walford getting a position in this department. I wouldn't have before. Okay. So, yeah, go Wendy. Make her listen to this. Okay, so now that's enough of the big picture. Now I want to sort of come down to some empirical issues to show you a little bit about how this approach might work in actual research. And I'm going to look at how examining the rural economy through a rural studies lens, and also look at how we might think about how population affects society. Okay, so here's the embedded rural economy. Now, okay, so I'm sorry for the quality of this. I don't have the originals on my computer anymore, so I had to take pictures out of the book. So again, here you see globalization, neoliberalism, industrial restructuring, international migration, and information technology. All of these forces outside of local communities impacting local communities, having an effect on the organization, family organization, and family capital, and then going down to how people put together a livelihood. So again, typically when people study the rural economy, they look at they look at spatial differences in things like industrial and occupational structure, labor utilization, levels of income inequality and poverty, what have you. And I've done a lot of that myself, okay? But rural studies locates these explanations more in what happens outside the communities and examines how these macro changes affect the livelihoods of rural households. Gonna see it on here. Okay, so now here's some work that I did in Hungary. This was in the 1990s, and my colleagues and I wanted to know, how do people make a living in these places with 30 and 40% official unemployment, where the formal economy and the social welfare system had collapsed, and in which the pension systems had basically disappeared. And so what we found was that the informal economy stepped up to make the difference. And the informal economy, including self-provisioning and also exchanging with other households, are the two aspects that we looked at. And these have very interesting characteristics. You can make money by exchanging with others, and you could reduce the need for money if you do like self-provisioning. And these are governed by norms of reciprocity, which means that not only is this an avenue to increased resources, it's also a way of strengthening social structure in the community. And also, it opened up many more opportunities for women because women were the primary participants in the informal economy. So this is the survey we did in 1998, and this is the survey we did last year with money from the Polson Institute. Thank you very much. And you can see that between 1998 and 2024, virtually every kind of informal exchange, the same thing goes for self-provisioning, declined dramatically. But it didn't disappear. You still got 30% who are exchanging garden produce. You've got a quarter who are doing farm work and yard work for people. So again, that's, I think, as much the social part of it as the economic part of it. And okay, why did this happen? Well, you can see that the official unemployment rate went way down, and so this is what we're examining right now, why these declines. And the big hypothesis, of course, is that the formal economy is in better shape. Okay, secondly, I want to look at I'm speeding up now. The whole idea of population aging, and if the population is aging, can you automatically expect certain kinds of outcomes? So changes in size, composition, and distribution of the population, does that lead to problems, challenges, and opportunities? Is that a sort of an axiomatic relationship, or is it mediated by institutions and civil society, places where there are choices to be made, either individually or collectively? Wait a minute, I went the wrong way. No? Oh, okay. So the median age of the population, big surprise, has increased. In rural areas now, it's about 40. And we did this paper. Nina is one of the authors of this paper. The hypothesis is, again, the demography is destiny hypothesis. Aging leads to a loss of services. That's the expectation. Well, here's one of the results. And basically, you can see this is a curvilinear relationship. And as median age increased between 1990 and 2010, where the data came from, as you get up to about the median, about 40, with each additional year of median age, availability of services increased. After I can tell you how I did this and give you some methodological information. But after about age 40, the access to services declines. So my colleagues and I wondered, is this necessarily the case? Is demography destiny? If you have increasing age past a certain point, are you going to lose services? And so basically, we thought this is the stuff that we should do a more qualitative analysis. And so we had thought about this before because we planned the quantitative and qualitative at the same time. And so we published another article if anybody wants it. And so we did in-depth case studies in 4 communities that had extremely old populations, median ages of 47 or higher, really old, and one in each region of the US. And we did interviews with service providers and both inside the places and with agency people outside at the state level, for example, and we did focus groups with residents in each one of the places. 3 of the 4 places adhered to this relationship, but one of them did not. So then the question is, why not? Why was one place, and in fact, it turned out to be the smallest and the most isolated, it was out in the plains in Kansas, why did this place not lose its services? So it had effective local institutions and responsive government. They had an active senior center. It was more than just a feeding site. The senior center is where all the action was for, and that's the same thing here in Tompkins County, by the way. A lot of the action is on the county office for aging. It recruited, this is really interesting. They kept track of high school graduates that went off and went to college, kept in good contact with them. When a doctor retired or a lawyer retired or whatever, when a business was going out or where there was opportunities, they contacted these people and tried to recruit them back. And so this had to do with attraction and retention. They were active in this. They invested in their school. The school was really an excellent school. It had the best band. It's a place of 3,500. Had the best high school band in the state of Kansas. I've revealed the state it's in. Shouldn't do that. Okay. And also they invested in community infrastructure. They had a movie theater that they built themselves, and they had the high school students working in. And they had as good of a health center as there is here at Cornell. Better than Helen Newman, I'll tell you. It's terrible. Okay, so they also had collaborative relationships outside of this little town. Again, they had really strong relationships with the area agency on aging, much more than the other places we studied, and also with state agencies. And they had a strategic vision. And this vision was, even though they were this small place, they were going to become a regional hub. And that really helped them invest in and have a very robust health system and a nice small hospital and a transportation system to bring people in from all over. So they were intentional about this. So extreme aging did not lead to a loss of services in this place because they were very intentional about it, because they had strong, responsive local institutions and they had good relationships outside. Okay, we don't need this. Now, this is the final thing I want to leave you with. This is a question. What are the expected impacts of changing race, ethnic composition of America? Now, is demography destiny? Or if the and you can see that the race ethnic composition of the US population has changed dramatically from 75% white non-Hispanic to 44 projected in 2060. These data come from the Pew Center. And this is a percent foreign born. The low at about age in 1975 or so, but it's been going way up. And you can see, however, the first time in about 20 years, it went down a bit during our current administration, but still historically high. So what are the results of this? Well, the expected impacts depend on kind of whether you see this as positive or negative. I mean, is this an opportunity or is this a problem? Is this replacement? You know, XYZ will not replace me. Will this be ethnic conflict and competition? Or will this enhance pluralism and multiculturalism and strengthen our democracy? Is this going to be labor displacement, or is this needed labor in particular industries? So it really depends on how you see this and what structural mediation might occur in terms of bringing about one of the other types of these results. Well, if you think that this is replacement, you might be involved in gerrymandering and chasing the electoral map to undermine the power of the group that's increasing demographically. You might also abolish DEI programs and protections. The Supreme Court at this very moment is considering the last effective part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so if they find against that protection, it's going to open up the door to even more loss of political power of various ethnic groups in America. Or you can pass civil rights legislation. You can have local ordinances that protect people of different types. So again, it depends on whether you think this demographic change is positive or negative. But regardless, just because a place is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse doesn't mean anything automatically in terms of the impacts. It depends on what society believes those results might be and how institutions develop to mediate those results. And with that, I made it to time. So, if any questions, comments, no fruit, don't throw anything. Okay. Yes.
Thank you so much for this executive session. My name is Benga.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. I've been thinking a lot about rural studies of society and industrialization, because that's something I think a lot of people in the generation are thinking about. So when you think about, for example, I think one of the big examples would be the Rust Belt in the US, where a lot of manufacturing companies that died out. And now, so would you say like those kinds of communities became ruralized because they lost those industrial power? And also in line with the reactions regards to climate change and a lot of conversations around scaling down industrialization. Is that the same thing as becoming rural in your government?
Well, I think in the way that now I'm really on. I think I was unmodulated most of the time. The way I would think of it is, again, I would go back to these two principles that sort of shape the way I look at these issues. How are places organized? How responsive are their governance systems? How robust are their institutional systems, like education, economic development agencies, what have you? And what are the relationships between that place and other places? So in the deindustrialization example, a place like Pittsburgh, for example, there was certainly, in terms of the place itself, there was a period of dislocation in which social welfare declined as jobs in steel and glass and whatever declined. But they had a lot of resilience, and over a period of time, they came back. And they didn't come back automatically. They came back because there was a lot of investment, especially by some of the bigger banks and the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon University. So I think that, again, it's not an automatic thing. Now, there are lots of places that used to have strong industries that have declined dramatically, in not just in the past, but recently. And so the questions really is, how salient is redevelopment? How economically feasible is it? Are there resources to do this? And how much political commitment is there to remake the place? With respect to the other, and also, who works there? What's the connection between, say, downtown Pittsburgh and the Schuylkill River, not Philly, the Monongahela and the Allegheny River valleys? That's where these plants were all sort of located, but there was a lot of commuting into them. And so this connection between that place and other places, both in terms of its labor supply, but also where does capital come from? Where's the information that permitted them to remake their economies? And so I think that really, again, it's an interactive, globalized world, and that you can't just look in the place itself. You have to look at these relationships. Now, with respect to climate change, there I think you get a really good example of how the external forces, nobody's immune to the impacts of climate change, either on on residents or on work or whatever. And again, I would be looking carefully at those relationships to see extent to which they are assisting places to be resilient with respect to climate change or undermining resilience. Probably not the best answer, but that's what I got.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm a student in global development, and I have a question about the preserving rural character of areas. So if we take Tompkins County as an example, a lot of the county prides itself, I would say, an asset to have sort of this rural character preservation of a little bit more of the past. I'm wondering who gets to decide what counts as a rural characteristic. For example, I know a lot of rural areas don't have internet. If we add internet, does that make it now urban, not taking away the rural character? Or if we add in public buses, is public transit an urban characteristic now in one area? So I guess who gets to decide what urban aspects can be in the rural area, and what takes it away?
Okay, I'll take a shot at this, but I'm going to ask if there are other people in the room, not to put you on the hot seat, Mildred, but you might want to join in here. Who decides? Well, in the best of all possible worlds, you've got a responsive democracy. And okay, well, something's going on right now. And that has to do in the town of Lansing. The town of Lansing is considering being the home of a big data center. This huge multinational corporation wants to locate one of these huge data centers there. So who decides whether, and it would provide quite a few jobs. So who decides? Well, actually in one of the local newspapers, there's a big article on this today. Believe it or not, there is a local newspaper, just it's online. It's not, although now there's one that's in the grocery stores. But so I have a friend who's on the planning council in the town of Lansing, and he's been telling me a lot about this. And there's a very strong conflict between those people who look at this as a source of jobs and tax revenue, and those who say that this is going to, first of all, increase the cost of electricity. All of us in this room who pay for electricity in Tompkins County are going to feel this, because these data centers use so much electricity that it reduces the supply for other than them, so that it boosts up the rates. But also the whole idea of what does this do to the town of Lansing and to its character? And some people oppose this because they don't want this big facility out there in the landscape. So they're concerned with the way things look. And now I would say in terms of Tompkins County, it does have a rural character, but a lot of it doesn't look so good. I mean, you may have a lot of open country and nice farms and stuff, but a lot of the built environment is pretty poor, because once you get outside of Ithaca and the 10 square miles here, you've got some reality out there. And this is part of the Appalachian Regional Commission. And there's a lot of rural poverty in this county. You might not feel it on this campus, but drive out 15, 20 miles and you'll see it. So I think these decisions, in the best of all possible worlds, are collective decisions. And I think in Lansing, this decision is being made in a democratic way, and that we'll see what the result is. But there's going to be winners and losers probably. So David Kay, are you wanting to say something?
Just briefly, I mean.
So this is David Kay, and he knows a lot more about this than I do.
Well, I'm not going to answer the question. I think it's a very excellent question. It was framed in an empirical way, but I think it's really interesting when you think about democracy in this context. It's the question: who should decide? Given, should it be only the people who live there now? Or should it be the people that might live there in the future? Should it be the people who pay energy bills, et cetera, et cetera? So we start thinking about the way that the system of democracy works right now in the United States. There's some answers that are empirical, like you said, that they're complicated. How would you work it out? I think from the theory perspective of democracy, in particular in rural places, because of all these interconnections that you highlight and your work between places and between people in different places, it's more interesting in a way to ask who should be deciding and why.
You know, in political sociology and political science, there's these competing models. One is the pluralism model, in which people have access to decisions, and that you don't win all of them, but you win some of them, so you keep in the game. And the power elite model, in which the place is completely dominated by a small economic elite. I'm simplifying this, but that's the contrast. And so in a place that has a more pluralistic, democratic model, then you have opportunities to bring more people into the decision making, so that the decision, which may not be perfect, but is at least some kind of a compromise that makes you feel like it was important to be in the game, that you had an opportunity to affect this decision. In the power elite model, most everybody is frozen out. And so these decisions are made by specific interests, typically economic interests. And again, if you don't like it, that's just tough. So I don't know if this responds to your question, but as far as the rural character, that's very subjective, what people think of as a rural character. But so if you go to England, where we had 2 sabbaticals, you'll see that they pay a lot of attention to the way the landscape. Our TA, she's like that. There's what just was in Ireland. It looks nice in the country, doesn't it? You don't see a bunch of fallen down old buildings. Everything's mowed nicely. It's all in order. It's all neat. Well, that's not just random. That's a decision, a collective decision that these people have made to maintain the countryside. I'll tell you another thing we learned at the Center for Rural Economy in England is that rural issues are much more important in England and Ireland and Wales and what have you than they are here in the United States. That rural people have a lot more power. And this issue is a much higher priority issue, maintaining the rural countryside, providing, and one of the sort of ironic results there, if you look at poverty rates by degree of urbanization, those poverty rates are lower in the rural than in the urban. In the US, they're higher in the rural than in the urban. Why is that? Because a lot of people with a lot of money have been moving into the rural areas in England. They have net in-migration from urban to rural, whereas here it's the other way around. So again, it depends, I guess, on values and who has the power. You might argue that the reason why rural England looks so good is because you got a bunch of rich landowners that have all the power that decided they wanted the countryside to look nice when they go out there to hunt foxes. So again, it's complicated. That it?
Do we have time for one more question, or are we done?
It's fine. Maybe one more
One more right there?
Uh-oh.
Mind if I can as well, but please, so this is just.
Thank you. David, this may not be a really great question for you, but I'm just kind of curious. I recently read Bill Bishop's The Big Short book and come across a couple of other engagements of people agreeing and disagreeing with him. I'm curious on your perspective on that body of work, which says there's people on self-filtering themselves, moving into different communities. How is that going to impact the concept of rural studies?
Boy, that's one. First of all, I haven't read The Big Sort, but I am aware of the fact that we are dividing into clans or tribes here in this country. I think it would undermine the degree of democracy in local communities. That I don't think I can't imagine any beneficial result of the big sort. I don't know, unless you're in the group that's on top. So.
The book is in the library, if you want to get a look at it. Thank you very much, David. This was an excellent presentation. Thanks.
If anybody wants to buy a copy of this book, email me and I will make sure you get the discount. That's not cheap.